Welcome to Sleep Horror, where true horror stories will make your heart race. Once you've listened, tell me which story you loved the most by dropping a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe so I can bring you more episodes. The title of the story, The Unseen Caller. Sophie Harris had always prided herself on her independence. At 29, she had spent years working tirelessly to build her career as a marketing executive in a small, sleepy town in Maine. The job was demanding, but her quiet suburban home offered solace from the chaos of her busy life. The evenings were her sanctuary, peaceful, predictable, and serene. But this weekend, everything would change. Tom, her fiancé, had to leave for a business trip, and Sophie found herself alone for the first time in months. Despite her usual comfort in solitude, an odd sensation lingered in the house that night. It was subtle at first, just the way the wind howled against the windows, the odd creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She brushed it off, though. The house was old, and old houses had their sounds. The weather was turning, too. A storm was coming. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She settled in the living room, curling up with a book, trying to lose herself in the pages. The dim light of the lamps flickered once, briefly, but Sophie dismissed it as nothing more than a power surge. "Just an old house," she muttered to herself, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. As the clock struck midnight, she felt it, a thick, oppressive stillness in the air, as if the world had quieted around her. She turned the page of her book, but her attention was divided. Her eyes darted to the hallway that led up to the second floor. Something didn't feel right. The creaking floorboards, the way the wind tugged at the windows, everything seemed amplified in the silence. Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. It came from above, from the hallway on the second floor. Sophie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no one else in the house. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, a sensation that made her stomach twist. Slowly, she stood up, her breath shallow, and crept toward the stairs. "Sophie." The voice was so faint, it could have been her imagination, but the voice, soft and fragile, came from the same direction, the upper floor. It wasn't Tom. It couldn't be. "Sophie!" The voice was louder now, desperate, but it seemed to echo through the house in a way that felt wrong. It wasn't just in her head, it was real. With a pounding heart, Sophie rushed up the stairs, the soft glow of the hallway light barely cutting through the dark. She walked down the corridor, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath her feet. Each step felt heavier than the last, each sound more ominous. She reached the door to the guest room, her hand trembling as she gripped the knob. It was empty.
The hallway stretched out in front of her, its dark corners seeming to whisper her name. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She darted down the hall to the master bedroom and checked the windows. Everything seemed fine, yet something gnawed at her, like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Hours passed, the silence between the winds howling only broken by the occasional creak of the floorboards from above. Sophie locked the doors and checked the windows once more, convincing herself it was nothing more than nerves. Yet no matter how many times she tried to reassure herself, the sensation lingered.
It wasn't until the clock neared 3 a.m. that Sophie heard the sound again, the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps growing louder, descending from the attic. Sophie's heart raced in her chest. She had never explored the attic. It was filled with old boxes and forgotten junk from previous owners, a place she had never dared to venture. But now those footsteps were unmistakable. It was as if someone or something was pacing above her, waiting for her to notice. The whispers grew clearer, almost mocking her. Her name dragged out into the silence, echoing through the house, pulling her into the darkness. Sophie's pulse quickened, her instinct screaming at her to run, to leave this place. But she couldn't. She had to know. She grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and slowly made her way to the attic door. The creaking sound from above seemed to grow louder with every step. The whispers now a cacophony of voices she couldn't understand. Her hand shook as she reached for the handle, the cold metal biting into her palm. With a deep breath, she twisted the knob and pulled the door open. The attic was dark and musty, the stale air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stepped forward, the beam of light flickering with each step. Her eyes fell on an old wooden chest in the corner. She hesitated, but something about it drew her in. Slowly, she moved toward it, her flashlight casting long, terrifying shadows across the room. When she lifted the lid, her breath caught in her throat.
Inside the chest lay an old photograph, framed in tarnished silver, of Sophie and Tom. The picture was taken years ago at a family wedding, but as Sophie stared at it, she felt a chill creep over her. The faces of both Sophie and Tom were scratched out, the markings jagged and deliberate. It wasn't the work of a child's doodles. It was something far more sinister. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to touch the photograph, her mind racing with questions. Why was this here? Who had done this? Before she could answer herself, the door slammed shut behind her with an ear-splitting bang. Sophie whirled around, but the darkness in the attic was suffocating. The whispers now felt like they were inside her head, surrounding her, pushing her into the corner. The flashlight flickered one last time and died, plunging her into darkness. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they were deafening. Sophie's breathing became shallow, her hands pressed against her ears as if trying to block them out. But it was no use. The voices were everywhere. The attic door opened again, but when Sophie tried to flee, her feet wouldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't scream. The darkness swallowed her whole, and the last thing she remembered was the whisper of her name, the voice almost loving, almost familiar. The next morning, Tom returned from his trip, expecting to find Sophie waiting for him, but the house was eerily silent. He called her name, but there was no response. Panic crept into his chest as he searched the house. Sophie was gone. Her phone, however, lay in the living room on the floor. The screen cracked. There was one new message, a single text. "I'm still here." Tom's hands trembled as he read the message again. The hairs on his neck stood on end as he realized that Sophie had never left.
The title of the story: Whispers Beneath the Bed. Hannah Stewart had always prided herself on being a rational person, a graphic designer by trade. She was grounded in logic, in facts, in the hard, measurable world around her. But when she moved into her new apartment in downtown Toronto, the world she thought she knew began to warp. It was a charming place, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. And though the building was old, she found comfort in its character. Little did she know, this apartment would soon turn from a haven of solitude to a place of unspeakable dread. The first night in the apartment, the creaking of the hardwood floors felt familiar. She attributed it to the house settling, the natural noises of a building trying to breathe. There was nothing sinister about it. But as the days passed, the sounds began to grow more deliberate, more pronounced. It was as if someone or something was moving around the apartment at night, but she was always alone. It started with the floors beneath her bed, then spread to the walls, the ceiling. A soft rustling, faint but there, each sound crawling deeper into her mind. She brushed it off at first. Toronto was a city of old buildings, and the sounds were just part of its charm, or so she told herself. But it wasn't the sounds themselves that made her uneasy. It was the timing. Every night, just as the clock struck midnight, the noises would start. Quiet at first, like the soft shifting of fabric, then a low, guttural whisper. It was almost imperceptible at first, just a murmur in the stillness of the night, but each night they became louder, distinct, unmistakable. "Help me," the voice seemed to say. It was barely audible, a sound that sent a chill crawling up her spine. The first few nights she'd lay in bed, eyes wide open, heart racing, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination. But the whispering continued. It never stopped. Desperation began to settle in her bones. After a week of sleepless nights, Hannah couldn't take it anymore. She was a pragmatic woman, and this was not something she could explain away. The whispers weren't just sounds. They were intentional, deliberate. She needed to face whatever was haunting her. One evening, when the clock struck 12, Hannah decided to confront the source of the noises. She mustered her courage, trembling slightly, as she grabbed the edge of her bed and flipped it over. The old wood creaked in protest as she shoved it aside, revealing the floor beneath. Her heart pounded in her chest. She expected to find dust, maybe some old items she had overlooked in the rush of moving in. But there was nothing. The floor was spotless, almost too clean. No scurrying rats, no forgotten objects, no hidden secrets. Nothing. The bed frame groaned as it settled back into place, but the whispers didn't stop. They were still there, growing louder, more frantic. Hannah's pulse quickened, and she stumbled back, looking around the room in search of an explanation. But there was none. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was waiting for her to acknowledge it, to look for it. Her hairs on the neck stood at attention, and she felt as though she was being watched. But by what? By whom? The next morning, with bleary eyes from another sleepless night, Hannah decided to research the apartment. She needed to understand what was happening, to grasp something tangible. She scoured the building's history, speaking with neighbors, looking through old records. That's when she found the story. It was buried deep in the building's archives, an article from the 1950s detailing the mysterious disappearance of a woman named Alice Caldwell, who had lived in her apartment years before.
Alice had been a young woman in her mid-20s, a quiet artist who kept to herself. She had vanished one night, just like that. No trace of her was ever found. The police investigated, but the case went cold, and the apartment was left vacant for years. They say her disappearance was linked to the strange occurrences that plagued the building since then. Whispers in the walls, cold spots, eerie sensations. Most people avoided the apartment, but those who didn't were said to hear her calling out for help. The article mentioned that Alice's body was never found, and that no one had ever truly solved the mystery.
But the most chilling part was the note at the end. It is believed that Alice's restless spirit lingers in the apartment, seeking something that was left undone. Her whispers have been known to call out to those who occupy her space. Hannah froze. The hairs on her neck stood up once more, this time from the sheer terror of the realization. Alice's whispers weren't just random noises. They were deliberate, intentional. She wasn't hearing a ghost. She was hearing someone trapped, still alive, calling out from the darkness. That night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the narrow streets of the city, rattling the windows of Hannah's apartment. The rain beat against the glass, but inside, the apartment was suffocatingly still. As midnight approached, Hannah sat in her bed, wide awake. Her eyes flickered to the floor beneath her bed. The whispers were louder tonight, almost frantic. It sounded like Alice's voice, desperate, pleading. "Help me, please." Suddenly, the floor beneath her creaked, and her breath caught in her throat. She could feel something moving in the darkness, something far too close. It was coming from beneath the bed.
Hannah's heart raced as she slid off the bed, her hands trembling. She crawled to the edge of the bed, her breath shallow as she peered beneath. The shadows under the bed were thick, too dark to make out any shapes. But then her eyes caught something. Two pale, thin hands, outstretched and gripping the floorboards, emerged from the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. She was frozen. Then the hands slowly began to pull something or someone out from beneath the bed. The figure that emerged was not a ghost. It wasn't Alice's pale spectral form. It was a man, his face gaunt and twisted, his eyes wide with madness. He smiled, his lips curling into a horrific grin. His breath was cold, and the whispering came from his lips now, not from the shadows. "I was waiting for you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been waiting." Hannah stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror. The man's hands twitched as he moved forward, dragging himself toward her. And then, in that moment of complete dread, she realized with a cold shiver that the whispers weren't just Alice's. They were his too, alive, breathing, waiting for someone to find them. The apartment wasn't haunted by a ghost. It was a prison.
The title of the story: The Late Return. Tessa had always lived her life on the edge of adventure. As a 25-year-old photographer, she was driven by the need to capture the world in its rawest form, often chasing the perfect shot long after the sun had set. That evening was no different. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a fiery orange glow over a forgotten woodland not far from her cottage in Maine. She had ventured deep into the woods, aiming to capture the fleeting beauty of the dying light. The air was crisp, and the world was silent, except for the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. But as she trekked back to her car, an unsettling feeling crept over her. The path leading back seemed longer now, the trees pressing in closer as though they were watching her. It was a strange sensation, one she could never quite explain. Tessa paused for a moment, brushing a lock of hair out of her face, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds beyond the wind, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. When she reached her car, a familiar sense of unease settled over her, but she chalked it up to the late hour and the isolation of the woods. She slammed the car door shut, shaking off the feeling, and started the engine. As she drove along the winding roads, the fog rolled in from nowhere, thick and dense, like a wall that surrounded her car. She squinted through the windshield, barely able to make out the road ahead. The radio flickered, crackling with static, before a low, intelligible whisper cut through the silence. Tessa's heart skipped a beat, and she immediately turned the dial, but it only made the static worse. A chill ran down her spine as the whispering grew louder, though the words were still impossible to understand. It felt as though they were coming from inside the car. She glanced nervously in the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see someone or something in the back seat, but it was empty. She reached for her phone, fingers trembling, but the screen remained frozen. The static continued to grow, matching the rhythmic pulse of her rapidly beating heart.
The fog seemed to swallow her whole until, finally, she saw the faint outline of her cottage in the distance. She breathed a sigh of relief as she pulled into the gravel driveway. But something was off. The air was colder than it should have been for this time of year, a biting chill that cut through her jacket. The house, an old, secluded cottage nestled on the edge of the forest, groaned under the weight of the wind. The familiar creaks of the house felt different tonight, louder, sharper, as though the house itself was alive. Tessa stood by her car for a moment, listening to the wind howl through the trees, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She shrugged it off, exhausted from the day's adventure, and grabbed her camera bag from the passenger seat. The cottage greeted her with its familiar, cozy warmth. Yet as she entered, the unsettling feeling continued to hang in the air. She flicked on the light and locked the door behind her, then set down her gear. The house seemed to settle into its usual rhythm, but Tessa couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sounded louder than it should have. She paused at the foot of the stairs, her heart racing. It was late, and she was tired. She told herself it was nothing, just the house settling, the wind rattling the windows. But then it happened. A soft sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, not from below, but from the attic. Slow, deliberate. They echoed through the floor, one step after another. Tessa's breath caught in her throat. She stood perfectly still, her pulse hammering in her ears. The footsteps stopped. A long silence followed, stretching unnervingly between the walls.
Then she heard it again, a faint whisper, soft and incomprehensible, coming from the direction of the attic. She swallowed hard, gathering the courage to investigate.
Tessa climbed the creaky stairs, each step groaning under her weight. As she reached the attic door, she paused, the air thick with an oppressive silence. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of dread remained. Slowly, she turned the knob and stepped into the attic. The dusty air smelled of age and neglect. Boxes were stacked haphazardly along the walls, their contents obscured by years of dust. Nothing moved. Nothing was out of place. Yet her eyes caught something unusual, a glint of something metallic beneath the floorboards. Her heart skipped a beat. Tessa knelt down, brushing away the dust and debris, revealing a weathered photograph. She picked it up cautiously, her fingers trembling as she studied the image. It was a black and white photo of a woman standing in front of her cottage, exactly where she was now. The woman looked strikingly familiar, though Tessa couldn't place why. Her face was old-fashioned, her dress from a time long past. But what unsettled her most was the date on the back. October 21, 1943. Tessa's stomach churned. The woman in the photograph was none other than her grandmother. Confusion washed over her. How was this possible? Her grandmother had died long before she moved into this house. And yet here she was, staring at a photograph of her standing in front of her cottage, taken years before Tessa had even lived here. Her heart raced as she pieced the fragments together. The whispers she'd been hearing, the footsteps, everything made sense now. It wasn't just her imagination. Her grandmother had once lived here, and her presence lingered, unable to move on. But why? What was it that kept her tied to this place?
Tessa spent the rest of the night trying to piece together the mystery, but the whispers never stopped. They grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to beckon her, urging her to leave before it was too late. The next morning, Tessa decided to visit the local library. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Finch, looked at her with a knowing gaze when she asked about the history of the house. Mrs. Finch hesitated for a moment before speaking. "That house," she said softly, "has a long history. Your grandmother, she never left. She died here, but her spirit stayed behind, waiting. It's been said that anyone who enters the house is bound to hear her whispers. She's trying to warn you." Tessa's blood ran cold. She felt a chill wrap around her as the truth sunk in. Her grandmother was still here, still watching, trying to communicate, trying to warn her. And now it was too late. The house was hers. The spirit of her grandmother had claimed it long ago. The twist came slowly, quietly. Tessa's grandmother wasn't trying to warn her to leave. She was trying to save her from the same fate that had befallen her. The whispers were not of a ghost, but an echo, a warning from the past. Tessa had already become part of the house, part of its curse, and soon she would be gone too, trapped in the attic forever.
The title of the story: Whispers Through the Walls. The air in Maine had always carried a certain stillness, especially during the late summer evenings. The smell of pine mingled with salt water, and the soft rustle of the leaves in the trees was the most unsettling sound Megan had known in her quiet neighborhood. But that evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, there was an eerie stillness in the air, a quiet unlike any she had ever experienced. Megan, a young woman living alone in a charming Victorian house nestled at the edge of a sleepy town, had grown used to the peaceful solitude. The neighbors, if they even noticed her, were respectful of her privacy. But there was one thing she couldn't ignore: the house next door. It had stood abandoned for as long as she could remember, its windows boarded up with thick planks of wood. No one had ever lived there, and no one ever spoke of it. The house had always been a source of curiosity for Megan, a place where forgotten memories and whispered stories seemed to seep from its rotting wood and crumbling brickwork. It was a Wednesday evening, and Megan was just settling in after a long day of work. Her routine was interrupted, however, when she noticed a flicker of light from the house next door. It wasn't the steady glow of a light bulb, but an intermittent flash, like something was moving inside. Megan squinted from her kitchen window, but the light was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Her heart raced a little, and curiosity gripped her tightly. She grabbed her jacket and stepped outside, the gravel crunching beneath her feet as she walked toward the house. The wind, which had been calm moments earlier, suddenly picked up, sending a chill through her body. It was strange how the air felt colder near the house, as if it were drawing the warmth away from her. Megan hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the front of the building. The tall, gnarled trees around the house seemed to bend toward it, like sentinels guarding a forgotten secret. But the allure of the unknown was too strong. Megan crossed the street and climbed the rotting steps of the porch. As her hand reached for the door, she felt a shiver run down her spine. She pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the stillness of the night. Inside, the house was oddly pristine. Dust hung in the air, but the furniture was meticulously arranged, as though someone had carefully placed each item in the exact spot it had always been. The clocks on the walls ticked steadily, but their sound felt out of place, too deliberate, too mechanical for a house so long abandoned. Cobwebs draped from the corners of the ceiling, yet the rooms were untouched by time. The oppressive smell of decay filled the air, but it wasn't the smell of rot. It was the smell of something that had been forgotten for too long. Megan's heart pounded as she stepped deeper into the house. The floorboards creaked under her feet with every step, the sound loud in the silence. She pressed her back against the wall, scanning the rooms for any signs of life, but saw none. Only the soft tick-tock of the clocks filled the space. And then she heard it, the faintest whisper, so quiet it was almost a figment of her imagination. She froze, straining her ears. Nothing. The whispers had stopped. Megan exhaled, forcing herself to dismiss the sound as nothing more than the wind, maybe playing tricks on her. But the moment she moved further into the house, the whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct. She could swear it was calling her name. Megan? Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was soft, feminine, and there was an undeniable sense of urgency in it. Her instinct told her to turn and leave, but her curiosity was a powerful force she couldn't fight. The house had always haunted her thoughts, and now it was as if it were pulling her deeper, beckoning her to learn more.
Following the whispers, Megan found herself descending into the basement. The wooden steps creaked with each careful step she took, and the air grew colder as she moved deeper into the house. The basement was damp and dark, the only light coming from the dim bulb overhead that flickered as if it were barely hanging on to life. The smell here was thicker, stronger, like something long buried, hidden from the world. In the far corner of the room, Megan spotted a small, weathered chest, its lid cracked open just slightly. She couldn't resist. She approached it, the creaking floorboards beneath her feet the only sound in the otherwise oppressive silence. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, revealing an old leather journal. The pages inside were yellowed with age, the writing fading and smudged in places. She could barely make out the faint scrawl. With a sense of foreboding, Megan flipped through the pages. The words were jumbled, but a particular entry caught her eye. The house calls. The door must remain shut. The walls must remain silent. The spirits are restless, and they seek a soul to claim. One has already been chosen. A chill crawled up her spine. The words on the page seemed to blur as her heart raced in her chest. She felt a sudden pressure, a suffocating weight on her chest. The whispers around her grew louder now, urgent, as if the house itself were alive, aware of her presence. Megan. Her eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing. The whispers seemed to come from the very walls themselves. She slammed the journal shut and backed away, but something in the room shifted. The air grew heavier, thick with an energy that wasn't there before. Megan's breath quickened as she reached for the stairs, desperate to leave. But as she turned, her foot caught on something. She stumbled and fell hard against the floor. The whispers intensified, becoming a chorus of voices now, rising and falling in an otherworldly crescendo. Panic surged in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, but the basement door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Megan,
You've awakened us. The walls seemed to close in on her, the very house shaking as if it were alive, its pulse matching her frantic heartbeat. She reached for the door handle, but the whispers were all around her now, louder and clearer. She couldn't escape. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Megan stumbled into the darkness beyond. The last thing she heard was the voice, low and guttural, speaking through the walls. The house is no longer empty, and neither are you. Megan never returned home that night. The next morning, when the neighbors checked on the house, it was once again silent. The old crumbling house stood just as it had before, with no signs of disturbance. But from the walls, if you listened closely, you could hear faint whispers, just faint enough to almost make you believe they were your own thoughts. And Megan, she had become a part of the house now, her whispers lost among the others, forever trapped within its decaying walls. The title of the story, Echoes of the Hollow House. The house stood in eerie silence as Emma and her younger sister Lily stepped out of the car, the rusting iron gate creaking open in protest. The worn Victorian house on the outskirts of the small town in Maine seemed to welcome them with open arms. Despite its time-worn appearance, the house held a peculiar charm, something Emma couldn't quite place. After months of searching for a new place to start over, this seemed like the perfect opportunity. It was isolated, peaceful, a perfect escape from the chaotic noise of the city. But as they walked through the front door, Emma felt an odd heaviness settle in her chest, like the house itself had been holding its breath for years, waiting for them. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and the quiet of the place seemed too still, too unnatural. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet, a faint whispering sound that felt out of place in such an empty house. "Emma, look at this place," Lily said, her voice trembling with excitement but tinged with uncertainty. "It feels old." "I know," Emma replied, trying to reassure her. "But it's ours now. Let's make it home." They began unpacking, the silence broken only by the occasional rustling of boxes. The house was colder than expected, with drafts creeping through the cracks in the walls, but Emma couldn't ignore the strange feeling that lingered in the air. As she settled into her new surroundings, she noticed small things, an old photograph, unmarked and wedged behind a loose floorboard in the attic, the unsettling creak of the stairs late at night, the whispers that seemed to drift through the hallways, barely audible but undeniably present. Lily, who had always been more sensitive than Emma, began acting strangely.
At first, Emma dismissed it as stress from the move, but the changes were undeniable. Her sister, once bright and full of energy, now spoke in cryptic phrases, words that didn't seem to make sense. Her eyes, once full of life, had become distant and hollow. She started talking about things that didn't exist, things that Emma couldn't understand. The house, it seemed, was slowly getting to her.
"Lily, are you okay?" Emma asked one evening as she caught her sister staring blankly at the wall. "I can hear them, Emma," Lily murmured, her voice flat and cold. "They're calling me. They want me to join them." Emma's heart skipped a beat. It was as if Lily was no longer there, but someone or something was speaking through her. The weight of the house seemed to press harder on Emma's chest. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was all in Lily's head, that it was just the stress of the move. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. The night the house truly revealed its dark side began like any other. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as the temperature dropped, a biting cold creeping through the house. Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling when she heard it. At first, it was just a faint whisper, a voice so soft that she thought it was her imagination. But then it grew louder, more distinct, and she realized the voice was calling her. "Emma! Emma!" Her heart raced. It was Lily's voice, but there was something off about it, unnatural, distorted. Desperate to reassure herself, Emma climbed out of bed and made her way down the creaky hallway. The house groaned and moaned with every step she took, as though the very walls were alive, pressing in on her. She reached the basement door, and that's when she heard it again, clearer this time, Lily's voice, low and guttural, whispering her name from below. Her stomach twisted into knots. She hesitated for only a moment before she forced the door open, the hinges squealing in protest. The basement was cold and dimly lit, the shadows seeming to stretch unnaturally across the room. Emma's eyes scanned the space, looking for her sister. And then she saw her. Lily stood in the far corner of the basement, her back pressed against the wall. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide and unblinking. The look on her face sent a chill down Emma's spine. It was as if Lily wasn't there at all, as if her body had been overtaken by something else. "Lily?" Emma called, her voice shaking. "Lily, are you okay?" But the voice that answered wasn't Lily's. It was something darker, deeper, like a growl that echoed from the depths of the earth. "I am here, with them, and I'm never leaving," the voice rasped, sending a tremor through Emma's body. Lily's eyes shifted slowly toward Emma, and for a moment Emma could have sworn she saw a flicker of recognition, but it was quickly replaced by an eerie emptiness. Her sister's face twisted into a sinister grin, the kind that no longer belonged to the person Emma had once known. "You shouldn't have come here," Lily whispered, her voice
echoing with something ancient. This place was never meant to be your home. Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was as if the house itself had a soul, a malevolent force that had been lying dormant, waiting for someone to take up residence. And now Lily had become its unwilling vessel. The realization hit Emma like a ton of bricks. Her sister was no longer herself. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed others before her. Emma could feel it. The house was drawing her in, its grip tightening around her throat, whispering promises of darkness, of oblivion. "Please, Lily, come back," Emma begged, her voice breaking. But the thing that wore Lily's face just smiled, stepping closer to Emma with slow, deliberate steps. The air grew colder, and the whispers from the walls grew louder. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the room seemed to close in on her. She knew with a horrifying certainty that the house had chosen her next. Lily was lost, and Emma would be the next to fall under its twisted influence. In that moment, as the shadows enveloped her and the whispers grew deafening, Emma understood the truth. The house was no ordinary building. It was a prison, a trap that fed on the souls of those who dared to enter. And now it was after her. With a final desperate scream, Emma ran, but the house wasn't done with her yet. As the walls closed in and the whispers filled her mind, she realized there was no escape. In the darkness, only one thought remained. Emma had become part of the house. The title of the story is The Midnight Visitor. Megan Hartley had always loved the idea of solitude. After years of city life, the allure of a quiet Victorian house on the outskirts of a small New England town was too tempting to resist. The house, with its peeling paint and ivy-covered walls, exuded an eerie charm, an ancient charm, one that seemed to breathe with its own life. The townsfolk had whispered about the house for years, claiming it was haunted. But Megan dismissed the rumors as nothing more than old folklore. She had always believed in logic, and the idea of ghosts didn't hold much weight for her. The first night in the house was peaceful. Megan had unpacked, settled in, and curled up with a book by the window. The setting sun bathed the room in a golden glow. The gentle sound of rustling leaves, the only thing breaking the silence. It was the peace she had been craving. But as the clock struck midnight, the calm was shattered. At first, it was subtle, like a tap on glass. Megan looked up, half expecting to see a bird perched on the windowsill. But when she peered out into the fog-shrouded yard, she saw nothing. She turned back to her book, brushing off the strange sensation, attributing it to her nerves from the move. But then it came again. A soft, scratching sound, persistent, unmistakable, as if someone, no, something was trying to get her attention. Megan's heart began to race. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate, and now accompanied by something else. A whisper. Megan. Her pulse quickened as she bolted from her chair and rushed to the window. The night was black as pitch, the fog thickening around the house like a suffocating blanket. There was nothing out there, no figure, no movement, just the silence of the yard. Megan opened the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she leaned outside, scanning the area. Nothing. The scratching stopped and the whispers faded, leaving behind an unsettling silence. Megan forced herself to breathe steadily. She had to be imagining it, she thought. The wind, old houses creak. It was probably just an animal. With a nervous laugh, she closed the window, pulled the curtains shut, and climbed into bed, determined to forget about the strange incident. But that night, as the clock neared midnight again, the scratching returned, louder this time, and the whispers, they were closer. "Megan," they called, the voice soft and mocking. Her heart pounded as she shot up in bed, her ears straining to hear. The noise was unmistakable, coming from the window once more. This time there was no mistaking it. She wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there. Frantic, Megan threw the covers aside and sprinted to the window. Her hands shook as she parted the curtains. Outside, the fog had grown thicker, swirling in patterns that made no sense. The yard looked like a scene from a nightmare. She scanned the empty expanse, but once again there was nothing. The whispers continued, drifting into the room like a cold wind. "Megan." Her breath hitched. The voice sounded like it was right behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing in the room. Nothing but the darkness. The air felt thicker now, almost oppressive, as if the house was alive, watching her. She collapsed onto the floor, clutching her head as the whispers echoed in her mind. They seemed to come from every direction, surrounding her. The next few nights followed the same pattern. Every night at precisely midnight, the scratching would begin, followed by the mocking whispers. It became impossible to sleep, as if the house was determined to torment her. Megan had tried everything, closing the windows, bolting the door, even staying awake, but the noises never stopped. Desperate for answers, Megan started researching the house's history. The library in town had old records, and she combed through them with growing dread. The original owner of the house, a man named Nathaniel Blackwell, had mysteriously vanished years ago, right around the time the house had started to gain its reputation for being haunted.
According to the old town records, Blackwell had been driven mad by something that had whispered to him every night, calling his name until his mind broke. It was said that no one ever saw him leave, and the house had been abandoned ever since. The townspeople spoke of strange happenings, of lights flickering in the windows when no one was home, and of people who had moved in and left shortly after, too frightened to stay. Megan's eyes scanned the records until she came across something that made her blood run cold. There was a photograph of Nathaniel Blackwell, taken years before his disappearance. He was standing in the yard, looking somewhat disheveled, but still human. But there was something strange about the photograph. The clothes he wore were eerily similar to the outfit Megan had worn the first night she had heard the scratching at the window. It was as though the photograph had been taken only days ago, not years. A sudden realization gripped her. Her hands shook as she pulled the photograph closer. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was as if she had been there, in that photo, in that very moment. Megan's heart raced as the truth began to dawn on her. She wasn't just hearing things. The ghost, Nathaniel Blackwell, wasn't haunting the house. He was haunting her. That night, Megan locked every door, every window, and sat in the middle of the room, her eyes darting to the clock. Midnight was approaching. The clock ticked loudly in the stillness of the house. The scratching came again, soft at first, then growing louder. Megan felt the familiar weight of terror settle over her like a thick blanket. She stood, unable to move, her gaze fixed on the window. The whispers followed, closer, louder. Megan. She walked slowly toward the window, her fingers trembling as she reached for the curtain. Her breath hitched as she pulled it back. Nothing. Just the empty yard, the swirling fog, and the dense silence of the night. Then she saw it, a figure standing in the distance, the silhouette of a man. He was wearing the same clothes as Nathaniel Blackwell in the photograph. The figure raised a hand, beckoning her forward. Megan took a step back, horrified. As the figure vanished into the mist, the whispers stopped, and the room fell silent. For the first time in days, she could breathe again. But as she turned to leave the window, a chill crept down her spine. On the floor beneath her, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. A photograph. It was a photo of her. Megan's breath caught in her throat as she bent down to pick it up. In the photo, she was standing in the yard, dressed in the same clothes she had worn the night she first heard the scratching. The ghost wasn't just haunting the house, it had been waiting for her all along. Her reality was now a twisted reflection of a nightmare she couldn't escape. And as the clock ticked toward midnight again, Megan realized that the game wasn't over. She was the one being hunted.